Good evening, U.S. History students. I hope you're all having a great night. I know some of you had a really late last night, so I hope this finds you all well and rested. I wanted to go over and actually do a video lecture this week and go over some of the Unit 4 book, and you will still need to read, you will still need to watch the PowerPoints, but I just wanted to kind of hit on the key points that I thought were important for you to know. I am grading all the activities, the quizzes, the discussion forums, and the essays. I will give you a lot of feedback on your essay. Don't panic if it's in all different colors, because I use the different colors to denote different things in my head to myself. I will let you know when you've done a great job, great wording, great usage. I will let you know when, okay, you need to start here, you should do it this way, you should do it that way. Please don't hesitate to ask me if a question if you don't understand why. If you don't exactly know how to correct it, I will definitely do whatever I have to do to show you, to explain to you, to whatever you need. I will be at both campuses on Thursday, September the 20th. And at that time, if you want to bring your paper with you and ask me questions after we go over a few things, absolutely, I will do that with you. Okay. With Unit 4, the first thing I want to talk about is the colony and the colonists. When the colonists first started coming over, they were not wealthy, and they didn't have the British coins to use or the British money to use, so they essentially used a barter system. And the barter system is just trading goods and services for other goods and services, and that's what commodity money was. It was bartering or trading goods for other goods or services, such as Virginia using tobacco to trade for other things. They had a surplus of tobacco, and they were able to trade that to get the things, the materials, supplies that they needed. Massachusetts was actually the first colony to print money, and the thing with the printed money from each colony was it did not transfer over to a different colony. So you could have quite a bit of money from Massachusetts, but you couldn't go over to Rhode Island and spend that money. So that was the problem with the colonial money. As long as you stayed in Massachusetts, you were fine. During this time, you're going to see a consumer revolution. And a consumer revolution is basically goods that were considered luxurious before are now bought by the average layperson, the average Joe. And so you're seeing more products that were previously only used for the extremely wealthy being used by everyday people, or being able to be bought by everyday people. There's also credit that is going to start getting extended to people, and as they do today, people started using credit and buying or getting more things with credit than they could actually pay back. During this consumer revolution, you would see some population booms, and the biggest cities during this time in 1775, the biggest cities in British North America were Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Consumer goods were being traded between colonial America and the Caribbean islands. And the Caribbean islands were made up of Barbados, Jamaica, Leeward Islands, and all of the American colonial colonies, and the Caribbean islands were owned by Great Britain, or controlled by Great Britain. The Caribbean would send to the colonies sugar, which was their main crop, the sugar crop, and mahogany. And the colonists would turn around and send the Caribbean islands their surplus food, surplus raw materials, livestock, and lumber, while the Caribbeans were deep into the sugar crop, they were cutting down all the forests to make room for more sugar crops. So there was a huge need for lumber within those islands. Now, because these islands were both British controlled, trade on the islands was to be used, the money, the taxes they got off the trade was to be used for Great Britain. And they would, both sides, the colonial and Caribbean islands, would sell to smugglers, sell to pirates, and so they would pocket that money on the side. There were laws against it, there were repercussions, but in the colonial America, where people were tried, there was very lenient sentences for those people. So this is kind of the beginning. You will see the beginning of Great Britain getting annoyed with what is going on over here, not reaping the benefits of what it thought it should, and which will start to build that tension going toward the Revolutionary War. During this time, the slave trade was still going strong. As we all know, Virginia started having a massive amount of slaves brought to the colony when tobacco boomed in 1619. In 1705, we're going to start seeing slave codes. And the slave codes were sets of codes that the slaves had to follow, or there would be punishments, which were incredibly cruel and inhumane. Defiant slaves, for example, could be beat, branded, mutilated, and sometimes castrated. There were laws passed where killing a slave was not a crime, or a murder of a slave was just a misdemeanor. Slavery was a part of life in the colonies. It was legal, and you will see a lot of the slaves in agricultural settings. There would be more slaves in the areas of the colonies where there was a better climate for longer crops, for the longer stability of crops that didn't have the harsh winters and or had shortened winters. You will still see slaves up north. They would be used on farms. There were some in urban areas that would have the job and title of a servant, that would be with wealthy families and would do whatever they needed them to do. In South Carolina, you'll see the slaves had a little bit more freedom in that the rice fields were surrounded by water, and around that water was disease. One of the worst diseases was malaria, and malaria, kills a lot of people. Slaves from West Africa were actually brought in, surplus to that area, because they had an immunity from malaria from the region they were in, and it was a genetic immunity. So they were able to work without getting sick. And the people that owned the slaves and owned the land did not usually reside in that area because they didn't want to get sick. They would be in a more urban area. And so a lot of times the slaves were not heavily supervised, but they were under a system called a task system. And the task system is basically where the slaves had lists. They had tasks that they had to complete daily, and once those were done, they were free to go cultivate their own land and grow crops for themselves. That went into them being able to sometimes sell their crops and to others and make a little bit of money on the side. And they were not heavily supervised by a master like other slaves were, due to the environmental conditions. Even though it was legal, slavery never became became increasing or never became rampant in the states of Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. And around this time, you'll also see the religious group, the Quakers, come out publicly against slavery and against the use of forced labor. I want to talk to you about the political structure of the colonies. The colonial government had two main divisions. A council, which was a government cabinet including the head of the militia and the attorney general, and the assembly. And the assembly were elected, and they were property owning men. They also were in charge of budgets, of the colonial budget, and they were in charge of taxes. Corporate charter colonies drew up charters that delegated power between branches and people and elected their own government. Corporate charter colonies included the colonies of Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Proprietary colonies were government appointed by a lord, proprietor, individual who bought the land rights. The colonies who fit under this category were Pennsylvania, Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland. And you also had the provincial colonies, which were royal colonies, and they were tightly controlled by the crown, by the King of England. These colonies included New Hampshire, New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. The printing press was in high demand and high use, and the center for printing activity in colonial America was Boston until the 1770s, and Philadelphia became the printing capital or the printing center of colonial life. And it switched over when Benjamin Franklin came to Philadelphia, and he had many works printed. And there was also a huge demand for German language press, and that was because there was an influx, a huge wave of German immigrants, and so they wanted text, they wanted things printed in German so they could comprehend it. Right around this time too, you're going to see the Great Awakening. In the Great Awakening, there's a lot of printed religious material, and one of the early religious books is called Early Piety. Now, during the Great Awakening time, you're going to see the revivals, and the revivals were rampant in many different congregations and many different denominations. You'll see the Congregationalists, the Baptists, the Methodists, and the Presbyterians all highly involved in revivals. Some of the religious leaders of that time included Increase Mather and his son Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, whose famous sermon is Sinners, it's Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And the most prominent, or the most well-known revivalist of the Great Awakening is going to be George Whitefield. And George Whitefield was a very charismatic, very well-spoken man. He had been an actor and changed over to being a preacher and being a revivalist. His dramatic flair for speaking absolutely riveted audiences. They were just captivated by him. People would come hundreds of miles to see him, and they would show up in crowds of thousands, and he would speak to them. And there are different accounts that you can read of people who were at a speaking event, a revival of George Whitefield, and just how much of an impact it made on them and everyone in that audience. go on through and at the very end are conflicts. I'm not going to go over all the conflicts with you. You can read that on your own. The 7 Years' War is important for you to read over, and you're going to see some figures in there like an early George Washington who was involved in the war and who was in the army and who led troops, and you can see where he got his start. And then you will look over Pontiac's War. I want you to read both of those. That is in your reading material for this week. So I'm going to wrap this up by just congratulating you all for making it to week 4. I know that this is a different format for those of you who've never taken a class before, and I appreciate all of you. I appreciate all your emails. I will always answer an email or a question that you have for me, so anytime, day or night, if I'm awake, I will respond. Otherwise, I'll respond to you as soon as I'm able, or as soon as I'm awake. So I hope this leaves you with a little bit more knowledgeable on some of the preludes to the Revolutionary War, because we will delve into that next week. Y'all have a good day.